Welcome to another off-season edition of Fantasy Football Today DFS. I am Sia Nejad at Sia Nejad, taking over again for Frank Stamfel. And today, my guest is none other than Andrew Erickson from Fantasy Pros. Andrew, how are you today?
I am doing excellent. We are the NFL draft is in the rear view window, so we're good with that. I can't even get my words together because of how stressful the draft was and trying to cover that thing. Not a lot of sleep, but we've recovered. I've had a weekend to recover, and the draft grades have been finalized, so I'm feeling good. I feel like I'm starting to finally shift into like season long analysis mode with fantasy football. Starting to do some of my rankings, kind of trying to figure out, okay, I had these guys ranked like this during the spring. Do I still feel that way as we head into the summer months? Now it's going to be all about OTAs. What about these rookies, the rookie hype machine? Oh man, I'm excited. So I'm doing great.
And for the listeners, I can promise you at the end of this conversation with Andrew, we are going to talk about some of the rookies who may have a high impact in the DFS space. In other words, early in the season, maybe we can get a handle on some of the guys who will be having an impact early, but we'll touch on that towards the end of the show. Andrew, where can people find you? I know it's at Andrew Erickson _ on Twitter. Where else can they find you and your
Yep.
content?
So yeah, at Andrew Erickson _ on Twitter. I'm also at Andrew Erickson _ on TikTok, where I'm trying to carve out a nice niche in this TikTok universe. I mean, the cool kids, all the high school kids I see occasionally, they always tell me how cool TikTok is. And they're like, Andrew or Mr. Erickson, you need to get on TikTok. And I'm like, all right, well, I'll give it a shot. And I've had one. I'm coming up on the 1 year anniversary, I think, because I remember my first video I ever made was on Najee Harris. And I made a
Mhm.
video about how he was going to overcome the offensive line woes of the Pittsburgh Steelers. And what do you know? 380 touches later, Najee Harris was able to do it. So, again, volume is king in fantasy football. And the TikTokers know that.
Yeah, Mr. Erickson indeed. It's a young man's game, that's for sure. So you mentioned you covered the draft, and I know you covered that extensively. I actually listened to some of your podcast show on the draft recap, which I thought was really good. And apparently you have some things to say about the Patriots draft, but that is for another time. So you cover the draft. I think you do some dynasty stuff as well, and you do some redraft and DFS as well. It sounds to me like you're covering the entire football landscape for Fantasy Pros. Is that right?
Yeah, exactly. Wearing a ton of different hats for Fantasy Pros. Basically, whatever they need, I am there to provide for them. So, rankings, dynasty, best ball, and doing more betting stuff. Like that's something that we're starting to see the fantasy industry and the betting industry kind of come to they're meeting each other. We're seeing the
Mhm.
overlap between them. Things are starting to get more blended together, especially with some of these companies that are now offering these, prop games where you're not necessarily betting an actual like player prop because you're parlaying it together with another one, making it a DFS game. But we all kind of know it is a player prop, which is obviously something that is super common in the betting circles. So that's something I've been having a lot of fun with as well because where I currently live, I can't legally gamble. So having some of these other DFS sites available to me instead does give me kind of a fun outlet so that I can kind of like get in on some action that's not necessarily, oh, I got to build a DraftKings lineup. I got to build a FanDuel lineup. A little bit more than that. So that's been a lot of fun as well.
Yeah, and you remind me, I'm an attorney. That's my background, and it's certainly blurred lines when it comes to the prop and betting and DFS space. But I mean, I'm here for it because it's giving us more options, Andrew. So I get that. But fantasy football today, DFS it's focused on NFL DFS. So I just wanted to get right into it with you, Andrew. When it comes to NFL DFS, do you have a process week to week that you go through? If so, just give me a general outline of what that is.
Yeah, I think for me, I try to look at the player pool and like who I'm like targeting. Who am I thinking about playing this week, and what are the reasons why? In terms of, okay, was it based on this injury that happened? I mean, that's like one of the biggest things throughout the week is just kind of keeping up with injuries. Is like if this guy's out, can we have confidence in this player? So things like that. Going through and reviewing the players in terms of how they were used the previous week. Did we see a player's role increase or decrease? What happened when this guy got hurt? So things like that are really what I look for. Again, it's funny because it's like I probably don't look at any actual box score. Like it's probably the last thing I would actually ever look at is actual the box score itself. I'm looking for what is more predictive. And if a guy scores 3 touchdowns in one game, it's like that's really not predictive unless he got like 20 targets. Like it's so weird how we could just look the other way, or at least I do. When a guy has a monster game from a scoring perspective, and then you just like, well, he only had like 8 targets, so that's not going to be sustainable. So it's like
Mhm.
whatever. Like I look the other way. So I think but it's cool that we've come this far that we know that we don't necessarily chase the points of the big game. We also know that we chase the opportunity and then lead to the big game. Something that comes to mind is that I think it was a couple of years ago where there was Will Fuller was like super popular owned after coming off like a terrible game, but
Mhm.
everybody knew that he was going to just explode because he had all the opportunity. Like targets were there. He was in the dome. He was playing the
Mhm.
Falcons. So it was like all lined up for Will Fuller to score like 60 points, and he did. But everybody else had him on their team. So it's like, oh, like I had this guy, and then it didn't even really end up making a difference. So things like that are what I look forward to when I'm doing my process.
So when it comes to actually picking the contest, are you more of a GPP player, tournaments, or cash games?
So for me, I used to be strictly cash games. So that's what I used to play the most. And then I kind of shifted away from them and also kind of came in with the props. Like I started doing more player props because I kind of view them in a similar light where you're you're kind of betting on this is going to happen. This is the most likely scenario. I'm not trying to turn a little bit of money into a lot of money. I'm trying to make smart investments based on these player props. So that's kind of what I started to shift towards. I was getting tired of the back and forth of cash, struggling with, oh man, like who has a higher floor. And it's like I just want to I want to play to win. And it was like with cash, it was like I just felt like I was playing to not lose, which I guess kind of is what you want to do. Like if you come in first place in a cash tournament, you're kind of like bummed out because you're like, oh man, like I should have
Mhm.
played this in a tournament. It's like you want to
Mhm.
finish like right above the cutoff line. And I just wasn't as entertaining to me, and the ROI on it wasn't as good as I was doing on player props. So I was like, you know what, I'm gonna invest more time into the player props, more of my bankroll into that, and focus on GPPs and more specifically small field GPPs because I felt that it aligned more with my goals that I wanted to do. Like I really am not playing DFS to like win $1 million. Like that's not my goal.
Mhm.
I really want to play to sharpen my mind and obviously want to win some cash along the way. But I want to play against like other people that I don't want necessarily to be beat by luck and just be like, oh, well, I didn't draft this guy that's 2% roster that I never even heard of because I'm playing in a tournament with 300,000 people.
Right.
I feel like the strategic or the strategy in a small field GPP, it gets you don't have to be super galaxy brained. You can
Mhm.
just pick, not necessarily like you just pick the right plays, but you have to be strategic with which right plays you end up playing. And I like the strategy more of the small field GPP, and it also aligns more with my goals. I'm trying to win, a couple $1,000s, in a weekend. That's really more what I'm aligned with. It also works with my workload. In terms of being at Fantasy Pros, like we do live streams before, every Sunday. So the last thing I want to do is try to, with 30 minutes left, have to change my, mass multi-entry of 150
Yeah.
lineups. I just wouldn't be able to do it. So small field GPPs for me, things I can hand build, and that's kind of what I've been gravitating towards. And I've had the most success with that too. Like that's the other thing. It's like I was looking at my ROI with large field GPPs, and it just wasn't where I wanted it to be. So I was like, you know what? I'm going to make the shift to small field GPPs, and I found a lot more success that way. So that's kind of what I'm going to be going at least into next year, playing a little bit more of.
So when you say small field GPPs, for the casual listener that doesn't necessarily know how many entries are in that type of tournament, I mean, just approximately, like what are you looking at when you're talking small field? Like, because some people might think, well, that's a 5-man thing. Some people might think that's
Mhm.
200. Some people might think that's 3,000.
Yeah, so for me, I usually want to be under like 1,000,
Hmm.
somewhere in the hundreds range is kind of what I look towards, and it can change. And I don't remember if there's like a specific tournament. I play most of my game DFS on DraftKings, but I can't remember if there's a
Yeah.
specific tournament. But like the things I've always noticed, I've just done better in smaller slates, especially like playoff slates. Just like when the players matter more and you're less likely
Hmm.
to be beaten by just random players because there's just less games going on. So like when the player pool gets a little bit smaller and even when the size of the field gets smaller, I feel like I'm less likely to get beat by luck and more likely to win because I am more skilled than my opponents. So that's
Yeah.
the way I see it.
Yeah, and I totally agree with that. I like the idea. So I kind of draw like a poker analogy there. When you can, back in the internet poker days when you could play, a 9-man table or a 6-man table. Like when you play 6-man, you feel like the hand ranges, like you can identify a little bit better, and it's just easier to overcome the randomness of maybe a couple extra players, like drawing to like a crazy card or something like that. I tend to have success in some of those niche tournaments or small field tournaments. For example, like the afternoon slate. Is that something that you do as well, or do you just generally play the main slate every weekend?
It's weird, I used to when I first started playing DFS, I like only did like the early slate because I don't even know why. I just like that's like what I think I won, really early on. I was like, oh, I'm just gonna do early. Like this is this is my thing. This is why I'm going to win. But I think that I'm going to do more of that. And really, I've always just done main slate because I feel like the content I've always made has always been around, the main slate. And that's what everyone always talks about is always like the main slate. But you bring up a good point where you're like, I mean, yes, it's saturated to a point where obviously it's a great content producer, but at the end of the day, like we just want to win. So if it's like, hey, I'm just better at, I don't have time to look at all these afternoon games. Like I don't want to invest the time into it, especially if they're all horrible games. Like let me just play the early slate, get it out of the way. I have stuff to do later on. And I think with like late swap too, that way, if you know that you're going to be tied up, you're not going to be able to late swap. I think it's an
Mhm.
advantageous of you to actually just do play the early games or only play the afternoon games. So I would say late swap would probably be one reason why I like playing the main slate because people don't take advantage of it enough, and I do. Like I make sure that I'm like usually on it when I'm checking my teams right before the 4 o'clock game or 4:25 games start to like kick off. I'm like, all right, where do I stand in this? Like, do I need to just pivot? Do I need to go more contrarian? Can I swap to some chalk here? So I like the strategy part of that. That's like just the coolest thing about DFS is just like the whole strategy, which I think people get super hyped out about the players and a very player centric analysis when you just play. I think the best DFS players in the world, honestly, are just better at the game itself
Mhm.
and not necessarily like, oh, they're a master of players. They can so easily project, these types of players. I think projections, obviously, knowing players is important, but I mean, if you were to tell me that you have the smartest football guy in the world versus the smartest, player of DFS in the world, like I'm gonna pick that guy. He could know nothing about football and only know about DFS. And I think that he would probably be more likely to win than someone that just knows everything about the football players.
So it sounds to me like you're saying the game theory is more important than the
Yeah,
game in this case.
yeah.
Okay, so let's talk about some. You touched on a few of the things that you don't want to chase box scores. You'll leave that for everybody else. You want to chase opportunity. But when it comes to looking at your player pool at the beginning of the week and starting to narrow it down, are there certain things that you are always looking for from an opportunity standpoint? For example, like snap share, route share, red zone targets. Maybe it's the wide receiver DB matchup or the defensive line, offensive line. Are there certain things that stick out that, hey, this is a box I need to check? I need to look at this every week when I'm looking at my player pool.
I think for me, I look at team stuff. So in terms of pace of play, like how fast is this team playing? We're trying to find the shootout games because this always happens where it's really one game that provides the winning lineup, and then you're just kind of like piecing together the rest of your roster. And it sounds so counterintuitive that you would just invest so much into one game, but that's you check out a lot of the winners and even winners I've had. It's like usually one game that just absolutely went nuclear, and then everybody just like hits their 99th percentile outcome, and that's why they all are part of the tournament winning stack in that case. So looking at games where you could have the potential for shootouts, I like to look at routes run data actually. Again, that has to do with player snaps to an extent, but it is a little bit more predictive in terms of what do you get before a target? You have to run a route. And I think it's really important to look at, especially from a percentage standpoint, routes run per drop back. Like that's something I wrote a lot about the last 2 years at PFF. Been leveraging their routes run data. How often is this player running a route per dropback? And I think it's really important because you get an idea of every time, Matt Ryan drops back, you're seeing Kyle Pitts run a route on 90% of his dropbacks. And then you look at that compared to all the other tight ends, you're like, oh my God, like he's on the field like so much more than every other tight end is. And it's not just raw snaps because it can get a little confusing because tight ends obviously are on the field when they're blocking. So kind of identifying the difference between those two because snap share can kind of be a little noisy sometimes. You're just looking at the raw number. It's like
Mhm.
when it actually mattered, like when they're throwing, because that's all we care about. It's like when they're throwing the ball, are you on the field? Like we don't care if you're run blocking. Like that doesn't help us whatsoever,
Right.
unless we get a new rule added into the game. So I think that routes run per dropback is something I usually look at a lot. Um, and just looking at players in terms of, I think you kind of hit on this, like looking at high value opportunities. So looking at a player that saw a lot of deep targets, player that saw end zone targets, anywhere I can get closer, like even getting closer than just like red zone targets. I'll even look at red zone snaps. Okay, like which running back was being used in the red zone. Okay, they didn't score, but especially parsing through some of these committees, you have to find a way to kind of figure out, okay, like this is the running back I want from this committee because they have the vice grip on the red zone usage and the pass game usage. Like that's what I care about, not necessarily, oh, okay, like he had 20 carries, this guy had 15 carries. Like the carries just doesn't move the needle for me. It's like who had the pass game usage, who had the red zone usage. That's what really matters. So those are things I really try to harp on during my pre week analysis.
Let me ask you one other thing about some of the tools and some of the things you may look at. A lot of people talk about wide receiver cornerback matchups, offensive line defensive line matchups, and for that matter, whether such and such team runs a cover 2 or a cover 3 or plays more man than another defensive team. Are those things that are also sort of critical in your analysis week to week, or does that end up being more noise than anything else?
I think it's a little bit more noise because it's almost like a paralysis by analysis. Like you're getting so much information about why you should start like, look, see, I can make an argument and spin it any way I want to make you want to like buy X player. Like there are
Mhm.
ways to do it. And then there's vice versa. Like there are ways I can make it to fade a player. So for me, it's kind of like if I need to like go digging to like find a reason to like play this player, it's like okay, it shouldn't be that hard. Like it
Mhm.
shouldn't be super obvious, like super under, trying to pull it under a rock, like why this player is a good play. Now, obviously, there are sometimes players that fly under the radar that become low rostership that are good players, and those are the ones that you want to point out. But for the most part, I mean, ownership projections are pretty good, and it's like those are the top plays for a reason, and
Mhm.
it's really not sneaking up on anyone. And by the time the week comes, again, people go on shows and talk about players, the ownership projections are pretty spot on in terms of like these are the best plays. I actually always recommend to people when they start sit questions. I'm always like, honestly, look at ownership projections. like those can actually kind of be helpful even from a season long perspective because they're telling you like the vast majority of people believe in this player this week. Now, again, it's a little bit you have to factor in price. Obviously, we talk about like a start sit or something like that, but you know, you can usually identify when players are just good plays and why they're just good plays because they're cheap. So you can obviously tell from the salary discrepancy. But yeah, I think that wide receiver cornerback tends to be a little bit noisy and overrated because and just I would say matchups in general are somewhat noisy and overrated because we think that we know what a defense is going to do when offense dictates defense. Like that's
Right.
something that I think is so important, and that's what it's crazy to me, but like if you were like, okay, Andrew, you can either have a player's usage the last 6 weeks, or I can give you the defensive matchup that they're playing this week, and I would take the offensive players 6 weeks game log and what they've been doing over the offense or the defense they're playing because we run into it so many times where it's like, oh, Jonathan Taylor, he's the best running back. Oh, but now he's playing the Bucks. Oh no, what do we do? Oh, what do you know? Jonathan Taylor had a great game because he's the best running back in the NFL. Like, and so much of and the thing is too is like for some reason we don't always understand this, but defensive numbers are just products of the offenses that they've played. So the defensive every time we're looking at a defensive stat, it's all based on who they've played. So something I always kind of draw a parallel to is entering this season. We talked about the football team. Washington has like, oh, like this is like a stout defense, and that was not the case at all. Like they were horrible on defense. And when you look back at their schedule, when they were, touted as a great defense, because they played a bunch of bad offenses.
Mhm.
So like that's something that I always try to like take a step back. It's like, you know what? Is this really a defense that I really need to be afraid of? Like who have they played? It's like they haven't played anyone good. So yeah, they may be the number one ranked defense against running backs, but they haven't played a running back like X. So things like
Yeah.
that. Now I think that you can be smart and actually look at a team and be like, no, like this defense actually is for real. I think that they can actually kind of slow down this player. But for the most part, I'm really looking at the offensive player first and letting defense, because defense moves ownership a lot. Like, who are you playing this week? Like Jonathan
Mhm.
Taylor. I think it was that week that he had a monster game and he was playing Tampa Bay and just like no one wanted to play him.
Well,
And it's
it
like,
was I think the game you're thinking of is when he was playing the Bills, and at
oh, the
that
Bills,
point,
right?
the Bills had only played, like, the Jets and the
Yeah,
Dolphins
exactly,
twice and a
exactly.
couple other just really bad teams, and then 185 yards and 5 touchdowns later, Jonathan Taylor is killing it for everybody who decided to play him, and I
Right.
remember specifically, granted, I didn't have as much, of a share of him as I wanted to, ultimately, but I was having arguments with people that were like, "Oh, no, the Bills defense, their run defense is so good," and it's right in your face. You look at who they're playing and then look at Jonathan Taylor and you figure out who's going to bend there.
Yeah, exactly. So that's why I feel like when you bet on the player based on their performance, based on their usage, more often than just relying on defensive matchups, because that's like the easy, and not to say it's lazy, but that's like the easier analysis to do, to be like, oh well, this team is bad against running backs. Like, okay, like here you just play the running back against them when you're not factoring in, oh well, what's the running back's touch share? How involved is he in the passing game? Does he have the red zone usage? What's the deal? So that's something that I think that defensive matchups get overrated, and wide receiver quarterback obviously kind of like falls into that category because I mean, like they're like the amount of cornerbacks that like actually shadow, wide
Right.
receivers is so small.
Mhm.
And I think it's good to like look at when a cornerback's like really bad and you want to target someone that he's playing a horrible cornerback. But most of the time it's like when teams have horrible cornerbacks, they're just bad anyway. So like you could get the same kind of data being like, well, the Falcons, I hate to bring them up again, but like they're horrible against wide receivers no matter what. And what they do is they just keep AJ Terrell on one side. So he doesn't follow anyone. So you just move your best receiver to the other side of the field, then he just destroys the second corner, and then it doesn't really even matter. So I would say that defensive matchups are probably a little bit overrated and something that, not that I don't listen to it because it's important. Because if I know that everyone is on this player because they're playing a quote unquote bad defense, then that's something that I try to leverage when I'm playing in small field GPPs.
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought up leverage because I think people don't really know in general, they don't really know how to deal with leverage and high ownership in terms of, hey, do I play this player? Do I just change? Do I play him? Do I pick up this chalk and just build my roster a little differently, in spite of the fact that I've got a couple of chalky players? Do I fade that guy altogether and all the chalky guys and just maybe focus on a different game? How do you handle the chalk conversation?
Yeah, it's so fascinating, how like it looks like such an obvious play, and then it's not an obvious play because it is an obvious play. It's so fascinating, the game theory behind it, and something that I try to do when talking about ownership in terms of how often you should roster a player. I always try to think in more terms of, okay, so what's the likelihood that this player actually like fails? Like thinking about it from a range of outcomes perspective. Now like, we can talk about this guy's the lock of locks, and we all know that that doesn't exist. Like the players, it's football. A lot of stuff can happen. A lot of weird things can happen, and more often than not, you usually want to try to leverage the ownership in terms. And so the way I think about it is when I think it was so Aaron Jones was out this past year, and AJ Dillon was really really popular. Of course, he's coming off a decent game. As the bell cow, I think they were playing the Vikings, so it was a
Mhm.
good matchup. So everyone was playing AJ Dillon, and the sharp play, and this should be kind of how you should always kind of view it is the sharp play was playing the Packers passing attack, and it's like no, like I'm not going to play AJ Dillon. I'm going to play Aaron Rodgers. I'm going to play Devontae Adams. I'm going to play Marquez Valdez Scantling. And you are getting leverage because you're not only fading A.J. Dillon, but you're taking advantage of A.J. Dillon not firing. So it's all encompassing. Like you need to know who the chalky players are, and then you need to kind of go in and address based on the roster that you're building. Now, I think that makes sense from like a tournament perspective. Like literally, you can make tournament lineups just based on, okay, who are the chalkiest running backs? Okay, you play their passing games because more often than not, like that's a scenario that can happen. Like Aaron Rodgers, and it's not even say AJ Dillon could have a horrible game. He could rush for 100 yards, but let's just say, Aaron Rodgers throws the touchdowns and AJ Dillon doesn't get the touchdowns. Okay, like touchdowns tend to be fluky from week to week anyway. So it's not crazy to think that Rodgers would have a good game, but you're going to get Rodgers at, sub 5% ownership. Marquez Valdez Scantling, nobody plays him. Oh, well, he's good for a blow up week. And in the week you play him, when it matters the most is when AJ Dillon is getting all the steam because people are paranoid about playing too many players from one offense. So those are things that I start to think about. And, don't always like playing guys because they're low rostered. You want to play, there are plenty of players that you can play that are good, that are still low roster, just because you can't play everyone necessarily. I think the misconception is people play really bad players because they're low rostered, and you really want to find the happy medium between a player that you actually like that people just aren't playing for what reason. And sometimes it's just because there are more obvious plays or defensive matchups that people like a little bit better, but you're seeing a guy that saw a lot of opportunity last week. Okay, he has a tough defensive matchup, but the opportunity, in your opinion, should be weighing heavily more into his ownership, and it's not reflected by, the market. So that's a player that I would try to gravitate towards.
That makes a ton of sense. And on the other side of the break, we are going to talk about, maybe encapsulate some of this and talk about what are 2 or 3 rules that Andrew Erickson would tell the average DFS player to follow every NFL DFS year. And we're actually going to touch on a couple of players from the NFL draft that he thinks might have an early DFS impact as well. And we'll do that after this break. And we are back with Andrew Erickson from FantasyPros. Andrew, let me ask you. So I've asked you about ownership. We've talked about leverage. We've talked about some of the, opportunity type metrics that you look at, your strategy, the types of tournaments you plan. Let's just break it down for the listener right now. If you could tell them, he or she, hey, here's 2 or 3 things when you go into the next NFL DFS season, which is coming up here in, 4-ish months. Seems like an eternity away, but it's around the corner a little bit. We got a dead spot here, but then it's gonna turn up a little bit. If you could advise that person, hey, these are 2 or 3 rules to live by in your NFL DFS year, what are the recommendations? What are the pieces of advice?
Yeah, so for me, the first thing would be to align your contest selection with your goals. Be realistic about, why you're playing DFS. If you're just, hey, I want to build a $5 lineup, build a $20 lineup, go in the Millie Maker, that's awesome. Like, go ahead and have fun, but like know your expectations and know that you probably won't win. Like that's just realistic expectations. But if you're really serious about, winning a couple $1,000s, then I would recommend like going into like the small field GPPs. Now, obviously the entry fees are a little bit bigger to make up for the lack of people, but you're going to be tested more strategically and not necessarily be beaten by your, these perfect lineups that are put together somewhat randomly and by guys that are entering 150 lineups where you're only entering one. Like understand what you're trying to go your here is. And the thing about small field GPPs too is like you don't have to be perfect. Like that's like the thing that kind of always like kind of calms me down. It's like you just need to build a 85th percentile lineup, 90th percentile lineup, not the 99th percentile lineup. You don't need to build that to win a small field GPP. So you can build a bunch of guys that have great games, a couple guys that have good games, and then you could win. So that's why I like the small field GPPs, and it aligns more with what I'm trying to achieve when it comes to DFS. So I would recommend to anyone to, kind of sit down and be like, all right, I'm playing with my bankroll is this. What am I actually trying to go? Like, what's successful DFS season in my eyes, in my opinion, and try to shoot for that and make sure that the contests you play align with that goal. So that would be the first one. The second one would be, again, something I mentioned before. So like leveraging chalk. So if you decide, hey, I'm not going to play this super uber popular running back, okay, then just don't just not play that running back. Then take full advantage. Like take a stand and be like, I'm not playing the running back. Instead, I'm taking that passing game because I think if this running game fails, which I'm already betting on anyway by not playing the chalky running back, then there's a probably good chance that the reason he fails is because the passing game is the reason that this player succeeds. So, and vice versa. It's like you just play if the passing game, this quarterback is super chalky, this super chalky stack between a quarterback receiver. Okay, what about the running back? Oh, the running back ends up scoring the 3 touchdowns. And now you not only get the low owned running back, you get the lapping over the field because you didn't play that passing game that has now failed because of the running back that you had. So finding ways to find leverage away from chalk. And then the last thing is something that I'm still, trying to work with in my mind is late news. And in terms of kind of preparing yourself a little bit ahead of time, we have so many injuries. I mean, last year, especially with COVID going on, was just an absolute nightmare trying to figure out who was playing, who was healthy. And it really tested us a lot. And I think that it's important to kind of have an idea in your mind of, okay, like, we're really 50-50 on this guy. Like, I need to know, like, once those inactives come out, I already know what I'm doing. I'm not contemplating, oh, like, this is going to happen, this is going to happen. Kind of have an idea of how to respond to this late news, because that's how so many, I think, DFS lineups are won and lost, is this late, or how to react the right way. A couple examples come to mind where, Tony Pollard, Zeke was ruled out random. I think it was like 2 years ago, and Tony Pollard wasn't rostered nearly enough. Like, he
Mhm.
should have been in everyone's lineups. If he had been, if Zeke had been ruled out that Friday, like, Tony Pollard would have been like 40% roster, because people would have kind of thought it through enough where they would be like, oh yeah, I mean, Tony Pollard, like, he's going to smash. Like, it doesn't even matter who they're playing. I think they were playing Pittsburgh. It didn't even matter because of the role Tony Pollard had. Again, going back to, a running back's role being more important than the defense they're playing. And then even this past year, week one, I remember we're all like sitting in our lineups, you're looking at, oh, the 49ers, oh, Trey Sermon is inactive, Elijah Mitchell's in, and then everyone plays Raheem Mostert. And then, oh, Raheem Mostert literally gets hurt like on the second play. And every lineup that you put Raheem Mostert in is now dead because he played. But we knew that once Trey Sermon was made inactive, Raheem Mostert was going to become, this mega chalky player. So it would have been smart to kind of think, all right, let's take a step back. And, what does the Trey Sermon inactive really mean? Does that really change Raheem Mostert's role? And I'm not to say that, Raheem Mostert wasn't going to have a bigger role. He could have, but maybe it would have been the same. And obviously we'll never know. But it's just kind of things like that. Reacting to that late news, I think, is really important, and still kind of able to get an edge, because I don't think that some people can react and make the right decision in that 90-minute time frame. Because again, you're up against the clock, because you only have a certain amount of time before you can make adjustments based on the news, as opposed to getting news and working through it all week, getting other people to talk to, getting the chance to talk to other people that are in DFS. And I think that that's something that, I'm trying to definitely do much better at, because I've made my fair share of mistakes of reacting to news in the wrong way and not thinking about it the right way. And that's something I really want to try to improve on.
That definitely makes sense. A lot of people are always, they're scrambling late in the
Mm-hmm.
game, and you really shouldn't be, because a lot of this stuff shouldn't be a big surprise. And even if it is, you probably should be prepared for it. What's a good situation? It almost sometimes doesn't matter who the player is. It really matters what the situation is. So totally agree there. Let me ask you, before I get to, I wanted to talk to you about the NFL draft a little bit, and maybe a good luck or a bad beat DFS story. But the last question I have on sort of this line of questioning is the tools that you use. I mean, maybe it's stuff at Fantasy Pros. I know you were with PFF prior to that. Maybe it's some free stuff or Twitter. Like, if you could direct people, just generally speaking, where to go to find some of these great resources, where would you tell them to go?
Yeah, so there's a couple ones I've used now. Some of them aren't behind paywall. So like PFF, you need subscription. Fantasy Pros, some of the stuff you need a subscription for. But I mean, I think it's worth it. I really think that it's tough nowadays to play DFS, and even if it's just ownership projections. Like I've I've used them so much more often than I would have ever thought. I would always think, early on in my DFS days, think, oh, you just play the best players, and then that's how you win. But ownership projections, because the way I think of it is that it's literally what your opponents are doing against you. And you should take advantage of that. Like, that's something that you don't, like in any other game. See, if I'm telling you, okay, this is what your opponent's going to do against you, like, you
Hmm.
want that information.
Hmm.
Now, and again, not every ownership projection is exactly spot on, but they give you a nice baseline to try to figure out, okay, like, this is what my opponent's going to do. How do I prepare and combat against that player? I think it's a really key part and preparation. Now, obviously, it changes throughout the week, but I do think that that's something that's essential, honestly, at this point with DFS. I feel like you are playing with a hand behind your back if you don't have some type of ownership projections to get an idea of what the market's doing. Now, maybe you do them on your own, you have a sense of feel for the market, then that's fine. But I know that I use them a lot out of all the tools. I think that ownership projection, I know that a lot of different sites use them, obviously. So PFF has them, Fantasy Pros has them. One that I've also used before is Daily Roto. They have them as well. But from a free standpoint, I mean, Team Rankings is something that I use a lot as a stats website, where there are ways that you can custom looking at like pass play rate, play pace per play, or pace of play, run rate of teams. You can look at targets. So that's something that I use a lot as well, comes from like a free standpoint. And then, like you had mentioned, like Twitter, like there's a lot of good information on. I mean, there's a lot of bad information too, but there is
Hmm.
a lot of good information on Twitter from people that, not necessarily like always like touting stuff. A lot of it is just people are sharing their knowledge that they find. Like, people are more than happy to share information. And it just takes a quick search on Twitter to basically kind of find out what you're looking at. So I think that Twitter is something that you should try to take advantage of, especially on Sunday morning when you're kind of setting lineups, you're tweaking through things to get an idea of where people are gravitating towards. And I know that, I try to tweet out a lot of different things, leading up to the week, things that I kind of just pop up when I'm writing my articles, creating my content, things that I find interesting, DFS nuggets, as I like to call them, that I should kind of like send out onto the Twitter sphere and hope that I get a couple likes in return. But I do that because I think that's interesting and I want to see people win. And if I can help in that way in any shape or form, like that's chalk a W up for me on my book. So those are things that I would probably recommend doing.
So if you're not already following Andrew Erickson, by this point in the show, he is at Andrew Erickson _. So a couple more questions for you before we get out of here. I had TJ Hernandez on a couple weeks back for this same format show. And I asked him just kind of a random question about a bad beat or a good beat that he recalls. It doesn't have to be last year. It could have been 5 years ago. I shared a story where I had a bunch of Kyler Murray and DeAndre Hopkins when they played the Bills a couple of years back, and that ended up really inuring to my benefit. On the flip side of that, I'll tell you a quick story. I had Kadarius Toney, and I was really easily on my way to an outright in a pretty big single entry tournament. He had already accumulated 189 yards, 10 catches, and then early in the fourth quarter, in garbage time, when he was getting all the targets, he decided to close fist punch somebody on the Dallas Cowboys with their helmet on, by the way, and he got thrown out of the game. So I just ended up, I basically fell like 2 catches and a few yards short of winning the thing outright. Any stories like that? I always think those stories are kind of fun to share because we can all sort of lament in our own plight when, these bad beats are good beats.
Yeah, I think that the only one that really came to mind for me, because again, there's been like so many ups and downs, ebbs and flows of the DFS season, which makes it so fun. Is the game that kind of sticks out in my mind was it was one of the Tyler Lockett just like absolute like explosion games. I think it was the game against Arizona where he had over like 200 receiving yards, and I just remember being on him all week long, like telling people like, the Cardinals cannot stop the slot receiver. Like Tyler Lockett is definitely the guy you want, because every week it was always like, all right, is it a Lockett week or is it a Metcalf week?
That's
like
right.
we always
Everybody.
do.
Yep.
It's like this is one guy. Like we're just not sure. And me and my other friend at PFF, we would joke around. It's like whoever Russ targets first, like that's the guy that's having the massive game. It's always the guy he throws the ball to first. And Lockett was just like on his way to like this massive game. And I was like going back and forth with this guy in first place, and I ended up not winning basically because of like other games that were going on. But I'm just like watching Lockett like just basically like bring me back up all throughout the rankings and try to like basically kind of finish with the top place. So that was something that was really fun. I was actually on the air doing Sirius XM radio at the time too. So I'm like looking at the TV trying to see what Tyler Lockett's doing. Did he catch another touchdown? Oh my God, like this guy has so many receiving yards. So that was a lot of fun.
That's fantastic. All right. So let me ask you a couple questions about this upcoming season. We just had the NFL draft. You covered that thing from top to bottom. I don't know if you actually gotten any sleep, Andrew. If you didn't, take a nap after this show. But I did want to ask you, there are some big ticket names, especially with the wide receivers that came out, especially in the first round, but second, third, fourth round, there were some wide receivers that came out that seemed to be in good situations, a couple of running backs that might be in good situations. And I know it's super early, so I'm not going to hold you to it, but is there anybody, whether it's a running back or maybe a few receivers, that are in such a good situation that you find it hard to believe that they won't have an early impact in the next NFL season?
Yeah, so for running back, I think it's definitely Breece Hall for the New York Jets. He was the first running back taken, and just the track record of first running backs going in the NFL draft, and you see them average around 240 touches per game, and that's about the RB18 in terms of fantasy finish and season long league. So like Breece Hall is going to be a guy we're going to be talking about, especially if the Jets offense can just be average. If Zach Wilson can take a step forward, I mean, he's got a lot of weapons around him. This is kind of what you do with these young quarterbacks. You give them weapons and they take a step forward. So they're hoping that Zach Wilson can kind of take a Josh Allen-esque type of leap after they put him with weapons. So I think Breece Hall is someone that I'm keeping my eye on. And honestly, all the first round rookie receivers, like I think that when we get salaries for DK when they first come out, I think they're all going to be way undervalued. They're undervalued in best ball drafts right now, but we're seeing rookie receivers like hit the ground running in the NFL. Like there's no like, oh, year 3 they'll finally break out. It's like, no, like they're breaking out like in week 3. Like that's what's happening now. So a lot of these rookie receivers, and in particular Sky Moore for the Kansas City Chiefs, I think that he attached to Mahomes obviously has massive upside, and would not surprise me at all if he like leads the team in targets. So Brees Hall and Sky Moore are two guys that I'm definitely going to be playing a lot in DFS.
Real quick on Brees. So obviously Michael Carter's on that team. Do you see a situation where it doesn't matter if Michael Carter gets a certain number of touches because Brees is going to be the lead back and that's going to be enough to pay off his fantasy and DFS value?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, we see this all the time with when teams invest in running backs, and usually it's because they want to do the bell cow. You know, if they wanted Michael Carter to be the bell cow, they wouldn't have drafted Brees Hall. So like
Mhm.
that's the thing that I kind of always take away from it, is they wouldn't have done that if they didn't want Brees Hall to be the bell cow. And when you do the math out, actually, it's like 14 touches per game for Brees Hall. You know, that ends up getting him to 240 over a 17 game season. And now 14 doesn't sound like a lot, but that's what, you know, a new kind of bell cow is in this NFL. Like there's not that many guys that get Derrick Henry-esque workloads.
Mhm.
And even the guys that do get the heavy workloads, like they miss a lot of games. So I really think that Brees Hall might be end up in anywhere in between the 17 to 19 touches per game. And as long as he's getting the pass game work, as long as he's getting the high value touches, you know, in the red zone at the goal line, which I would assume that he does, like that's going to be good enough for you. And I think that that's going to matter a lot. So yeah, Brees Hall, I think is going to be an RB1.
And Andrew, you're way too early. Super Bowl prediction for this upcoming season. Who's playing?
Oh yeah. So for me, it's going to be the Los Angeles Chargers because again, I know we've said this a million times. One of the best rosters on paper, Los Angeles Chargers. I feel like I say that every single season, but the Chargers against the Buccaneers. Tom Brady did not come back to not win another Super Bowl, so I will go with the Chargers and the Buccaneers as my Super Bowl prediction.
Actually love the Chargers, and I kind of have a hot take that people are going to hate me for, that Kansas City actually misses the playoffs and
Mm.
Denver and the Chargers make it. I love what the Chargers did with their roster, not just at the fun fantasy positions, but all around. I think the Chargers are in really good shape with Justin Herbert stepping up with an extra year. Andrew, tell us where we can find. We know we can find you on TikTok. We know we can find you on Twitter. What are you doing in the near future that we can go out and look for?
Yeah, so again, I'm over at fantasypros.com at Andrew Erickson _ on Twitter. And a lot of stuff I'm working on now is diving more into best ball. Best ball has kind of taken over as like this DFS replacement for me during the summer months, and I'm having a lot of fun with it. It's kind of a best of both worlds when it comes to redraft. When it comes to DFS, you kind of get to do a little bit of both, experience it, and it's been a lot of fun. Doing a lot of stuff with like Underdog and with some of these best ball 10s. So drafters, a lot of different best ball companies doing stuff with them. So releasing article content about best ball strategy, you know, the game theory, stacking, you know, who to target early, middle rounds, late rounds. And then at Fantasy Pros, we also have the release of the best ball draft kit to go along with our dynasty draft kit, which we continue to add to. So any type of coverage you need, you're playing fantasy in any way, shape, or form, I've got you covered in some way, shape, or form. So it's there somewhere in the profile. So anything fantasy related, I'm on it.
Well, everybody, go check Andrew out. Andrew, thank you for coming on to the show. We appreciate your time. We loved your insight. And this has been yet another edition, off-season edition of Fantasy Football Today, DFS, and we'll see you soon.